With me now is JJ McCullough. First of all, JJ, thank you very much for agreeing to do this.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
I've been following all of your stuff for quite some time, and just as a small appetizer, I'd like to go on this one. There's one of your more recent tweets. I just find it very interesting. You wrote, "There's an interesting phenomenon afoot in the form of far-left Canadians trying hard to make the Democrats vote farther left. I cannot imagine what the reaction of the Canadian left would be if a bunch of American right-wing activists were constantly agitating over who should be the director of the Canadian Budget Office, for instance. Yet, as you say, here we are." Expand on that a bit.
Yeah, so this is an interesting sort of phenomena, right? Which I suppose is a symptom of sort of the larger national drama that Canadians and Americans sort of have with each other. But a sort of curious phenomenon that sort of has occurred in this sort of modern internet age, the modern age of social media, has been the creation of a kind of subculture of sort of far left Canadians who are essentially what we would say is sort of role playing as far left Americans. Which is to say that Canadians on the far left who find, and perhaps not completely unjustifiably so, Canadian politics to be a little boring, a little blasé, a little low in the drama department. And so as a result, they've just decided to fully sort of submerge themselves into some of the warfare that is occurring within the context of the American left, within sort of the battle for the soul of the American Democratic Party more broadly. And so you have a lot of Canadians on the sort of the far left who have come out as sort of active Bernie bros, have immersed themselves into the kind of vibrant Bernie bro subculture that exists on social media and elsewhere online. A community that is, you might appreciate this reference, a community that's sometimes called Red Rose Twitter because they all use red roses in their usernames. And you know they post tweets and sort of agitate against what they perceive to be the embodiments of the sort of the sinister center left liberal sort of establishment that runs the Democratic Party, as embodied by people like President Biden and Vice President Harris. And they agitate against the president's nominees of sort of boring center left characters, people associated with sort of the Clintonite sort of wing of the party, if you want to say that. And just participate in these dramas. And it's like, fine, there's nothing wrong with, I suppose, being a principled person in this way. I don't particularly have a lot of time for the flavor of politics they represent. But to me, it does sort of come off as a little upsetting or a little disturbing or a little odd on some level. And it, for people of this country to be so actively, sort of playing along in the politics of another country. And this is also does not go unnoticed by some of these center-left Americans as well, who don't like being constantly, having a bunch of irate, downtown Toronto types getting on their case for not being left-wing enough.
The observation, reason why I threw it out, apart from the fact that it has some humor embedded in it, is that during the Trump years, his name is disappearing slightly. If you were watching all of, as you call them, the establishment media here in Canada, the big networks and the big papers, every little Trump item got blasted front page or lead item on the National, or they even went so far on the National to bring up Michael Avenatti. What was the source of this absorption in a great swath of even the established media, especially during the Trump years? Why was it that they were so eager to show what part of the bandwagon they were on?
Well, I mean, I suppose you could say that this was sort of part of a sort of larger kind of ideological phenomenon where you could say that perhaps a lot of sort of progressive journalists in Canada saw common cause with their progressive counterparts in the US. And there became a sort of more of a kind of class identity of what a journalist is, what a journalist believes, what should be the ideological objectives of, journalism with a capital J. And so I think that, like, if you come from this sort of perspective, a CBC journalist and a sort of New York Times journalist, or MSNBC journalist, CNN journalist, pick your brand. They sort of all sort of understand themselves to sort of be engaged in a common pursuit that is not really divided by country. It's divided by sort of ideology, and sort of that journalists are sort of part of a broad sort of tribe all over the world that is fighting for certain progressive ends, certain progressive goals. And, people like Donald Trump, people like, Johnson in the UK or Bolsonaro in Brazil, or, wherever you want to pick, that they represent a sort of a different sort of tribe, a different community that is sort of existentially opposed to the interests of the sort of the journalistic progressive objectives. Is
it not also allied to or part of, I'm not sure what the verb should be in this particular case, that a more than emergent idea of journalism is that the journalist, the columnist, all of them, that a great portion have imbibed the belief that they're there as kind of moral supervisors, or they're there as instructors or lecturers. They're warning you of what's the right way to see things. And for example, in Trump, of course, he had Mephistopheles himself. So they saw it as an obligation that in case you were too dumb to notice it yourself, we've got to tell you just how evil all this is. Journalism as a kind of higher preaching.
No, I think that's exactly right. And I think that has been a sort of battle in the soul of journalism for quite some time, as I'm sure you know. The idea is it okay to just be, the quote unquote neutral observer and to sort of just present the facts and trust the public to make up their own mind, as such as it is? Or is the obligation of journalists, as a kind of embodiment of a kind of more educated, more, quote unquote elite sort of class of people, do they then have that kind of noblesse obligée, as I think they used to call it, that kind of obligation to use their education and use their smarts and use their, and fair enough, like access to information that your average person doesn't have, in order to sort of bring forward the conclusions of their reporting, right? So if you're a reporter and you spend a lot of time following, the president of the United States around, talking to people in his inner circle and so forth. And if, listening to enough of this kind of stuff makes you realize certain conclusions about the way that the government is run, should those conclusions be shared? Or should you merely sort of present the more sort of objective sort of meat of the reporting in a strictly sort of factual way, and then just sort of trust the public that, they'll reach appropriate conclusions? But I think that there has been a movement towards not trusting the public. And I think in some ways a more sort of paternalistic and condescending attitude towards the public, where there's kind of a sense that, the public sort of needs to be steered a little bit more actively. And I think that the election of somebody like Trump can be used as Exhibit A, because I think that in many ways, like Trump's mere election, or, the success of Brexit, or whatever you want to quote, is sort of seen as a symptom of a kind of worrying public ignorance, a sort of spread of a kind of irrationality that in turn needs to be corrected by a more aggressive activist flavor of journalism.
There was one, I've asked this to a number of people, because to me, it stands out as one of the most remarkable individual moments in journalism, as demonstrating how far away from even knowing what it is that journalists do. This was the night, and I'll get off Trump after this was the night of the Trump election. And on Huffington Post, which is almost the decalogue of all right thinking, they had estimated that the likelihood of Hillary winning, this is half an hour before, Hillary winning was 98%, and that in the case of Trump, obviously it was 2. The New York Times, which is even more authoritative than the Huffington Post, they had on their little clock or whatever damn device they had for measuring it, they had Trump at 8% and Hillary at 92. Now this is the New York Times, which is probably undoubtedly the largest, deepest organization in the world of its kind. So here's my point in bringing up that stat so often. How can you be the premier news organization of great authority in the United States of America, studying the population, understanding the tones and turns of the American polity, and that on the night of an election, your projection is so wild? How can you be so ignorant of what was actually going to happen and then maintain any face of credibility after? How far can you get away from your public and still be a newspaper?
No, I mean, it's a worthwhile question. And I think that as much as sort of 2016 was sort of the high profile sort of humiliation in that sense, the 2020 predictions were not all that much better, that there was still a lot of embarrassment, and that Biden was predicted to win. And I know this because I actually have a website where I chronicled all of the different predictions that were made. There was much more prediction of a kind of landslide sort of blowout than I think, that we can say objectively happened. And this becomes very problematic in some ways, because if the journalists go out of their way to make authoritative statements that they, in their sort of deepest hearts, know are perhaps a little high risk, shall we say, that has sort of the net effect of discrediting the idea of expertise. It has the idea of discrediting the idea that objective realities actually do exist. And instead, it creates this idea that, I think leads to some of the populism on the right, where it's like expertise is just kind of a construction. It's a bit of a fantasy. It's just kind of a term that a certain class of progressive person uses to flatter themselves, as opposed to the fact that it's sort of actually grounded in a sort of empirical science that, would ordinarily be used when you're throwing around sort of probability statistics of that degree. There is a problem where sort of the left as well, or sort of like, more sort of progressively inclined journalists, have a market incentive to produce content that is flattering to their audience as well, or that tells the audience what they want to see. And this is, of course, a sort of universal problem. And I do sort of think that some of this kind of stuff is driven by a kind of market demand that can sometimes be a little bit uncomfortable for conservatives, sort of pro-market conservatives, to concede, that as we get into a political culture that becomes sort of more polarized, the communities on both sides have a vested financial interest in, preaching to the choir, so to speak.
Yeah. I'll switch it for a moment to your own career before I get to particular topics that you are rather more precise on than many other people. Tell me, what initially attracted you to this very strange or even dread profession? What drove you to come into the writing of commentaries? I also, by the way, should remark that you're a first-class cartoonist. What was the attraction, and how has it been getting into this game?
Oh, well, thank you for that. It actually was the cartoons that was sort of my entry point. I was very interested I've been interested in cartooning for my whole life. And, I became interested in sort of political cartoons, mostly because I enjoyed drawing sort of caricatures of politicians. And from there, in order to sort of become more literate in the world of politicians, I studied politics more. And then I started, I had a website where I posted political cartoons for quite some time. And I started writing sort of contextual write-ups to accompany the cartoons to help explain the context. And it was through, unfortunately, from my perspective, it was the writing that wound up getting more attention and acclaim than the cartoons themselves. And so it was sort of through my online writing, I suppose I'm a bit of a product of sort of the golden age of blogging, which is not something that you hear as much about these days. But through the success of my what we would call blog, I got picked up by a number of different outlets, including the recently deceased Huffington Post Canada, actually. And then from there, I went into
you poor bugger. That's a terrible thing to have happened to you.
I can't complain. I mean, the folks that were my editors at the Huffington Post at the time, I mean, obviously this came to an end at some point, were good and were supportive people. But it was through the Huffington Post that I started writing, and then I started getting, more requests to appear on television, do TV hits and this kind of thing. But journalism was never like the profession that I had sort of burning inside of me. And I mean, and some people will be resistant to myself even using that term, because I've done very little, kind of quote unquote formal journalism. I've mostly been an opinion commentator. And that was always the kind of person I wanted to be. I'm a man with a lot of opinions. I like sharing them. And I think that the role of the commentator is a perfectly respectable one. And I think it's a perfectly legitimate profession to aspire to.
I'm not so sure I can share the view. I got one other point, slightly personal, and if you don't like it, just don't toss it away. It seemed to me, I was aware, as you say, of your blog, which, by the way, now is almost an anachronistic term, believe it or not, and spotted, if I could say this, obviously got talent, intelligence, and coherence. And it was a bit surprising to me that over the 2 or 3 or 4 years when you were at the beginning of all this, there were a lot of people over on this side of the world, every now and then taking these gratuitous swipes. It seemed like you weren't supposed to be doing this for whatever it was about you. And then secondly, I'll pile it up. For those who do not know, Mr. McCullough here is a weekly columnist with the Washington Post. So while it seemed to me You couldn't have any friends in the so-called National Swim, a big American paper, second probably in authority, comes out. What was the irritation that you seem to be causing these people?
Well, it's a hard sort of question to answer because you don't want to get you don't want to get too self-flattering, right? Because I mean, like, the instinct is to sort of say, well, I'm saying the powerful truths that they can't handle hearing, that kind of thing. But I think with all sort of due humility, I think that there probably is some resentment towards the story of people like me. And it's not just people like me. It's also like some of the people that I myself was complaining about earlier when we talked about like the Red Rose Twitter Brigade, right? Yeah. It is, in some respects, the barriers to entry to becoming an influential, quote unquote, pundit or commentator are much lower than they used to be. In my opinion, in some ways, I think they're much more meritocratic. It's much more based on the idea, like, can you reliably produce content that people are interested in reading or writing, or sort of reading or consuming, or watching or listening to, if it's a podcast or a YouTube channel. And I think that editors are much more sensitive to that. They're much more inclined to hire someone like me, say, who has a pre-existing audience on his blog, on his YouTube, whatever, and want to sort of harness that audience. Whereas I think that strikes a lot of sort of the more old guard media as being a little bit topsy-turvy. And the idea that you get to be, and I'm sure you can relate to this, like, I've had people say this to me. It's like, the way you become a columnist is by putting in your time for many years as, a ink-stained reporter in the back room fetching coffee, and like, this is like the final kind of, coup de grace you get when you've accomplished, all of these sort of arbitrary check marks. And to sort of skip all of those steps, to go from being, a blogger to a Washington Post columnist, I think that strikes a lot of people as completely contrary to how this game is supposed to be played.
Yeah, I think you make a very good point. It's the defiance, and by the way, the stereotype, as you accurately portrayed it, of running around to the parish courthouse and covering the Kiwanis meeting down in Bay Bulls, and then doing that until you get your first cane. Then you're allowed to write a column, and that is ferociously no longer the case. While we're on this kind of topic, everyone is opining on this. What is the new relationship? The newspaper, the television, set time broadcast. These were once the great pedestals of all information. Now, it is done said, 'tis all coherence gone. Does everybody now really get the complete mix that you check the newspaper via the internet, incidentally, or you check your favorite one-time blog, or you go to this Twitter feed? Is the whole idea of journalism now a kind of unbounded series of tributaries, and there's not one place to go? And what is the competition between the independent-minded types and those that are starting their own sites and the big established so-called heritage sites?
No, I mean, it is very objectively one of sort of the big challenges of our time. The market pressures that sort of legacy, quote unquote, media faces, I think, are very real and are ones that we have to be very sensitive to. I'm very fortunate that I work for the Washington Post, which, is owned by the richest man in the world. And so that alleviates some of the financial. No, I mean, that alleviates some of the financial strain. And I think people who work for a paper like mine are very lucky in that fashion, in a way that some of these smaller outlets are sort of struggling and don't have quite that benefit. And then the problem, though, is that you get into sort of the phenomenon that I was talking about earlier, where it's like you quickly sort of identify, well, who is my base audience? Can I identify a sort of base audience who are likely to be very loyal if we can reliably produce a sort of content that, gets the endorphins going, scratches the nice spot on their brain, tells them that, Trump is either the devil incarnate, or conversely, that he's the greatest man ever. And, just sort of continues to agitate in that sort of direction. And sometimes and this is a problem that affects sort of new media as well. I mean, it's easy to sort of say that, as I did, that say something like MSNBC or CNN has sort of drifted more to the left just because they've become increasingly aware that that's just the side that the bread is buttered on, and that's a more reasonable sort of business model, a pandering business model rather than a sort of inclusive one. But this is the problem with upstart things as well. It's the problem with upstart podcasts, upstart YouTube channels, upstart blogs, to the extent that these still exist, certainly upstart social media celebrities. in the political space is that you very quickly sort of realize that in order to make a go of this as a sort of financial enterprise, you just kind of have to cultivate an audience that will be hyper loyal. And the easiest way to create hyper loyalty is to sort of flatter the audience and not present them with challenging or threatening information.
Yeah.
To just tell them what they want to hear. And it's kind of sad because I've seen sort of people in the new media space that have gotten trapped in this kind of like codependent relationship with an audience that they kind of don't like, because they realize that there's minded on some level, and that they're not interested in being intellectually stimulated. They're just being interested in being spoon-fed the same stuff over and over again. And I think when you get to the point where you start to have contempt for your own audience, that becomes a very dark place indeed.
Yeah, you make a very, very good point. I mean, the unidimensional quality of voting, it's more in the States, but there's some of it here in Canada, say on these panels, the CNNs, or not the news part of it, but some of the Fox presentations, the idea that somehow or other you're there as a place where people go to find verification and authentication of what they already think and believe, and that these are really confirmatory sites. They're not information, and they're certainly not exchange or debate. It would be a wonderful thing if you had some sort of metaphysical mixing bowl and you could take all the hosts of CNN, CNBC, and Fox and twirl them around until they blended into each other, and then stick them up on a show. Let me go from there to another one of the phenomenon of our time that is partly due to the birth of internet feeds. This so-called, I don't like the phrase, by the way, this so-called cancel culture, that whenever X or Y says something a little out or has said something a decade ago that then might have been acceptable, but is no longer. And then the great hordes of Twitter descend like locusts upon them, and institutions, even the New York Times, will bend and fire people who have been working for them for 47 years because they tripped over one single wire. What's this about? Are we becoming a kind of soft imitation of the enforced opinion regimes that were much more turbulent and certainly much more vicious under communism? But the idea that certain things can't be said at all, and if you do inadvertently or otherwise say them, regardless of intent, you have to go. What's your view on all this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it is the undeniable reality of our time in a way that is, increasingly unavoidable and, never sort of, I think on some level stops being completely disturbing. And it's like, you made the analogy to sort of like, the totalitarian sort of societies. And I think that, those analogies can be overblown. But at the same time, there is a kind of, there are some parallels that can kind of be too apparent to avoid. An example would be that there was this podcast I used to enjoy listening to quite a lot. It was like a daily podcast I listened to. Yeah. And the other day I was just noticing that there hadn't been a new episode of this podcast made in quite some time. And so I just, Googled the name, and it turns out that the host was, canceled a month ago for, a story that I had completely missed. And it's like this sort of strikes me as the kind of thing that is not entirely the symptom of a free society, where like you have to sort of like check up every so often to see if one of your comrades has sort of fallen afoul, and if that they have sort of, disappeared in one sort of sense of the term. Obviously not physically disappearing. And I mean, again, I don't want to overstate this, because a lot of people that have been quote unquote canceled have gone on to create, new sort of brands for themselves, usually by pandering harder to the to one sort of side of the ideological tribe, which I think can sort of cause problems in its own way. But it is definitely an anxiety that I think any journalist will confess to having, because the rules are so arbitrary and are so constantly shifting and constantly changing that it does require a lot of mental energy to sort of stay on the right side of them. I think I just really don't think that great things come from a climate in a profession that's supposedly supposed to be sort of intellectually robust, when there is that kind of gnawing anxiety that's always at the back of your mind.
There's one other thing to add to the list of epithets that you applied to it. The rules, as you referred to them, are all those things you said they are, but they're also tacit. They're unwritten. They're unspoken. There's an invisible censor inside of every typewriter's head that if I go over there, I'm going to be in real trouble. And here's another, I'll get your view on it. When you see someone, the reporter at the New York Times, whose name I forget, is a classic example. He's 47. He was a sports guy. He had all standing. He was a decent fellow. But I could give 100 others that when you get tagged as being racist, homophobic, or whatever the current objurgation happens to be, you see at first a bit of resistance. And then you will see, and this comes also, by the way, not only journalism, comes from the corporations and it comes from the universities, that when they want to appease the cloud of locusts, they come out with these grueling apologies that are so self-abasing. I don't like the totalitarian analogy either, but this idea that you self-confess, oh, I didn't know that, and I want to be as inclusive and diverse as I possibly can. Will you please, where's the spine in all of this? And why isn't there some snap back?
Yeah, it's no, I mean, it's like the sort of the analogy to like the struggle session, right?
Yeah,
like the sort of self-flagellation and all this kind of thing. And the disturbing thing as well is that it doesn't even work, right? Like that was the story.
It never works.
The young woman who was hired to be the editor of Teen Vogue. I don't know if you follow that story at all.
Yes.
You know, like she said some racist things, but had really tried to apologize profusely for it and try to redeem herself. And I was listening to another podcast the other day with David French, you know, who's quite a good sort of conservative pundit, and he was saying that when he was a young man, he always grew up being told that in America everyone has a second act. Like that was like the great cliche. Was that America was this sort of like almost like to a fault a forgiving society. And like now we're just so far on the other sort of end of that spectrum that there is no grace and that there is no understanding or sort of extension of the idea that we're all sort of human and that we're all flawed and that we all do this, right? Like that's the thing that I think is sort of uniquely sort of pernicious about it, is that, you know, we all know that deep down there is probably something that in some context, something from our past could have been dug up and used to sort of shame us. I think that it is fundamentally dishonest if anybody says that, like, no, my life has been so squeaky clean that I would be comfortable if my life was some sort of Truman Show style documentary, that there would never be a single incident that could be sort of resuscitated to cause me shame or embarrassment. And I just think that, like, knowing that, it does strike me as sort of fundamentally graceless that we have a culture now that prioritizes this kind of posturing and sort of saying, well, like, you know, anyone who had it coming, and that we shouldn't be sort of apologists for bad behavior, and this other sort of like piousness that I just think is, it's dishonest. Like at some level, it's dishonest. And unfortunately, I think, well, I mean, I don't know if this is unfortunate or not. I suppose it depends on your ideological perspective. But I do think that as much as the right wing sort of demagogues against this kind of stuff, I do think that the reform will probably come from within the left. That at some point, sort of like the more reasonable sort of faction of the center left is just going to get exhausted with this, because they have shown that, that they're not immune from it, right? And that left consumes left, and, you know, the snake that eats its own tail, right? And what I was saying before about the Red Rose Twitter and all the rest of it, like there is a sort of policing within the very community that claims to be sort of leading the charge on this kind of thing. And I think that any sort of revolutionary sort of ethos in that way often becomes exhausting to the people that initially kicked it off with the best intentions.
But just to underline, I wasn't going to go in this direction, but I've been for years really, but the last 6 or 7 months in particular, I noticed that one particular journalist who certainly is progressive and has been for the longest possible time, Glenn Greenwald, his analysis and its continuous, or his criticisms of what I've called cancel culture, about the operations of the news media refusing to admit their own mistakes. Greenwald is coming. In other words, he's coinciding with what you just said, that if the reform, and it has to happen because this is idiocy, if the reform does come, the brighter minds and the calcium-loaded spines of some people on the left are going to be the necessary instruments of what has to be corrected. This stuff really doesn't belong in any self-respecting democratic society.
And I have faith that it is a fad, that it is something that we will look back at as being just a unique sort of dysfunction of our time. As you know, I think that sort of weird ideological panics or fads or movements or sort of cultural sort of crazes sort of come and go over time. And I do have faith that this is fundamentally unsustainable. You can't cancel everyone. You can't have a society that is this paranoid. and that is engaged in just these constant bad faith efforts to kind of grind people down. Like you just can't, like at some point, like you'll just run out of people to hire, run out of journalists to employ, run out of people that are frankly interesting. And, you know, this is a problem as well, too, because, you know, one of the other sort of market sort of stresses that I think happens in sort of the current climate of journalism is that at some point you don't want all of the interesting people to just have their Patreon only private podcasts or whatever, right? Like you want those people to have columns and be on television and all the rest of it. You can't have a vibrant media that is supposedly engaged in, you know, the marketplace of ideas and creating stimulating content if you're sort of saying that no, anybody remotely interesting has to be sort of isolated into these little islands.
Just to your point about it being a fad, I don't know how long ago it is now. It would probably be, let me think for a second, at least 170, maybe 180 years ago, that Macaulay, Thomas Babington, made the, I think, classic axiom that applies here. There is nothing more ridiculous than the spectacle of the British public in one of its periodic fits of morality. And I think that covers the moment. Let me jump to some of the immediate Canadian themes that you have pursued and are pursuing. I rather like the idea that you're probably, I can't think of anybody else, you're probably the only one that I know that has a stern opinion on the double language requirement of Canadian administration and government, and that it restricts, I'll let you give your own description, it restricts the pool of those who can have any possibility of entering the echelons of the civil service. Give me your run on that.
Yeah, I mean, I do believe that. I do believe that it is sort of fundamentally an anti-meritocratic policy and an anti-democratic policy as well. Because the fact is that when you have a country such as ours, where only about 17% of people can speak fluently the two official languages, it is, you know, I believe, sort of unjust and undemocratic to then have a political system that is based around making that particular skill set the mandatory point of entry to any sort of significant job of seriousness or importance or power in the Canadian state. And I think, like, you know, that seems like a relatively self-evident argument to me. I think that if there was any other country in the world where you had an extremely small linguistic minority that hogged most of the most important jobs and power, that would strike us as a kind of deficient democracy in some way. And I think that we know this on some level. We think about how, you know, in the sort of the royal courts of old, everybody spoke French, even if it wasn't a French-speaking country, or before that Latin, or even if we think about the way that sort of the white South Africans, the Afrikaners, sort of created this Afrikaner language that they then used to disempower the more liberal whites. And like, you know, like there's many examples in which language is sort of used as an instrument of political power. And I think that Canada is a very vivid case study of that, because, you know, there was a fantasy that the old man Trudeau had that, you know, this was a bilingual country. I think was informed by a very sort of classic Eastern Canadian understanding of Canada as basically being, you know, Upper Canada, Lower Canada, the two founding nations, you know, all of this kind of stuff, right? And you know, and that was a sort of just a misunderstanding of the nature of the country, that nevertheless our federal laws were sort of, and our constitution were sort of bent in the shape of. And so now we all sort of have to endure this, which I think has a very negative effect in terms of actually allowing our most sort of talented people in this country to rise to the positions that they would otherwise be entitled to. The problem, though, is that I think that a lot of people just have a very odd understanding of language and how language works. And I do think that, you know, talking of sort of self-flagellation, I think it is very easy to appeal to a kind of insecurity that a lot of English-speaking Canadians have, where it's just kind of like, well, if I just tried harder, I would be fluent in French. And you know, like, it's in the same way that, like, I often analogize it to, like, you know, how people sometimes have a kind of insecurity about, like, that they're not thinner or that they're not more fit, right? Like that, you know, and it's no, it's true, but it's like, but with language, it's uniquely sort of false, because, you know, what linguistic science generally teaches us is that fluency in a language is generally obtained based on perceived need from the perspective of the speaker, not the need of some guy in Ottawa who says that, you know, we should all speak X, Y, or Z, but like your need for day-to-day communicative purposes. So as a result, there is never going to be a high rate of French fluency in Western Canada, just because the French language is not a fact of day-to-day living. That the Chinese language might be, the Punjab language might be, but it's never going to be French. And so I think at some point Ottawa and sort of the Ottawa sort of establishment has to wake up to this blunt reality and ask if a 50-year-old sort of objective of sort of appeasing French Canadian sensibilities is worth the enormous sort of toll it takes on Canadian democracy more broadly.
And talent. Here's another one from your Twitter feed. I know, by the way, you're a tremendous fan of Meghan Markle. I just wanted to get that out there. Canada has now officially gone longer without a Governor General than any period in recent history, a fact which has obviously impacted nothing and doesn't matter to anyone. It is an interesting consideration. You called it to mind. The Governor General resigns, and I can go back, because I'm an ancient bastard, I can go back 30, 40, 50 years, that even if a lieutenant governor was to walk down the street in Newfoundland, I mean, it was like the visitation of the Virgin Mary. Everybody is staggered with the idea of being so close to such an honored situation. But here's the principal surrogate of the entire monarchy, who resigns in a single day, so it appears, and nothing but silence and vacuum afterwards, in the middle of a minority government and a pandemic, when the constitutional stability of the country can at any day be questioned. And as you said, hardly anyone seems to notice it.
Well, I mean, I think that this sort of reveals, I think, a lot of the lie and the mythology of this position. I'm a pretty ferocious sort of anti-monarchist and somebody who has no time for any of this kind of falderall. And so one argument that I've sort of made pretty consistently is that I do think that a lot of the kind of the legends that we hear about the Governor General are just false. Like, I do not think the Governor General is a meaningful or consequential sort of figure in our government. And I think that the fact that we have not had one for over a month now sort of reveals that. I mean, it's interesting that you sort of say this, and this is actually something that I've actually been curious. I'm not that young of a whippersnapper, but I'm 36 years old, and I feel like within my entire lifetime, no one has ever revered the Governor General. Like, Governor Generals have never actually functioned the way that the press often sort of posits they do, which is, as this sort of like inspiring figure of national unity, and we all look to the Governor General for sort of national leadership in a way we would never look to the Prime Minister or some other sort of vulgar elected politician. I mean, I think that you could maybe make that case about the Queen herself, and I don't even know if any other member of the royal family, but like the Queen herself. But the Governor Generals, no, they really do seem like non-entities who are appointed quietly for like deeply sort of reasons of political correctness, including the language variable. And I do think it is a position that sort of Canadians have transcended. And I just because I think, as much as it's very easy to say that Justin Trudeau appointed a bad Governor General in the person of Madame Payette, I think it is very difficult to honestly imagine a good Governor General, just because I think that the nature of the position in this sort of paternalistic, sort of symbolic way is one that Canadian culture has just transcended.
I can go on forever and ever. Here's the best way to wind it down. You being an opiner, an opinionator. We're in this pandemic for a year. We've got blistered budgets, non-budgets, huge expenditures, all sorts of stuff going on. What's the political state right now? In about 2 minutes or less, where are the Liberals? Where are the Tories? If the NDP are still extant, where are they? And as far as I'm concerned, you can forget the Green Party, but just go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, I definitely think that the Liberal Party is still proving itself to be the natural governing party of Canada. I do think that for all of the problems that you and I have with them, I do think that, the Prime Minister's approval ratings have gone up quite a bit in the last year. I think that he has benefited from, the so-called rally around the flag sort of phenomenon. And I think that the Conservative Party in response has not really come up with a coherent justification for their own existence. What does the Conservative Party exist to do in the context of 21st century Canada? Who do they speak for? Whose interests do they represent? What is their vision of this country? And how is that vision noticeably different than that of the Liberals or the parties of the left more broadly? And I just finished sort of authoring a column about this, and you know, under Aaron O'Toole, a man of sort of moderate sensibilities, he seems to really be into this idea that politics is fundamentally transactional, and that if you can just come up with the perfect sort of laundry list of policy ideas, that's all it takes to close the deal with the Canadian public. But I'm just honestly not convinced of that. I don't frankly think that's how Trudeau got elected. I don't think Trudeau got elected because of what he promised to do, but rather who he promised to be. And I think that until the Conservatives can come up with a sort of equally persuasive answer to that question as well, who are we? What does electing us mean in a kind of like larger, almost sort of pseudo-spiritual sense for the nation and the national narrative? I think they're going to be struggling for a while. And I think in some respects, the more interesting question is what sort of Conservative leader will arise in response to what I believe to be sort of the looming failure of Aaron O'Toole in the next election.
Yeah, I'm inclined very much to agree with almost all, not almost all, what you just said. And also, I like that little turn. We avoid these words, incidentally, in most discussions. Let's take up something spiritual. I'm using the word in as wide as possible, but they have to have a bit more, as you say, than transactionality and the animosity that does exist in a red-hot core. Some of it quite justified against the Liberals. It has to be better than that. J.J. McCullough, you've given me a good deal of your time, for which I do appreciate it. And secondly, whenever you're talking with all those great authorities at that wonderful newspaper, The Post, give me a little pass on it. Listen, thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been great.